sometimes I feel like a horse, not one of the ones that's like out at my family farm that's like really in love with grass, that just really does nothing more than eat grass all day. No, I'm talking about one of those horses on the racetrack. Have you ever noticed those horses that are in races, they put blinders on them so they can only see what is right here, right in front of their face? And sometimes I feel like that kind of horse. I feel like someone who has these blinders on. I stay really focused on what I'm supposed to be doing. I've got one goal in mind, and I'm driven, and I want to get to that goal, and I put these blinders on, and then I wonder why I feel disconnected from God and from my family or my friends or my relationship. And then I hear the words to that song, "Open up my eyes in wonder. Build my life on a firm foundation of love." And what I recognize is that I cannot build a life with blinders on. I cannot build a life that is full of love and joy if the only thing that I am focused on is the thing right in front of me. There are times that I feel like I am asking God, show me you're here. Show me you're present. Show me you're real. And what I hear in those moments and what I hear in the words of that song is, Julie, you need only to open your eyes. Open up your eyes in wonder so that you might see a fuller picture of who I am, of who I've created you to be, of the story in your life that is far bigger and maybe even far more beautiful than what you can see in that narrow point of view. Open up my eyes in wonder. I want that to be my prayer today. I hope that will be your prayer today as we enter into this time. Speaking of wonder, speaking of eyes opening up, I get the great privilege this morning to introduce you to the newest member of our Access family. Miss Evelyn Michelle Chakowski was born on Wednesday, August 15th. She is 7 pounds and 13 ounces. And yes, I know too much. And yes, I'm way too excited. And yes, it is a girl. And I am so thrilled. I should have put money on it. I almost put money on it, but I didn't. Val was pretty surprised that it was a girl. They decided not to find out. So we are so thrilled for Eric and Val, our worship leaders. And I know that you will hold them in your prayers this week. So I went and got to see Evelyn on Thursday. And it's one of those weeks we're in the middle of the heat of summer, but everything is starting back up again, right? School's starting back up. Fall schedules are starting back up. And so all of the ease and breeze of summer is now just disintegrated. It's gone. And it's hot and it's busy. And in the middle of some of that busyness this week, I went and got to hold Evelyn. And she was awake, which is not often for a newborn. And I got to just put everything else aside for a few minutes and watch her open up her eyes in wonder. And I thought to myself, wow, is there a whole lot else that I'm super stressed about or frustrated with or mad about that really matters? I'm holding a miracle in my hands. A miracle whose eyes are open to wonder. And if I could just maybe take a glimpse of that into this next week or into this next day, to open up my eyes in wonder, what might God show me? Well, good morning. My name is Julie. I forgot to tell you that earlier. My name's Julie, and I'm the lead pastor here to this awesome Access community. And last week, we started a sermon series called This Is My Story, and we talked about how your story matters. Elle talked about it as your testimony earlier. I would maybe call it your witness. Your story matters. Your story from the day you were born until now matters. But oftentimes what we do is we begin to paint a picture that is not full. We begin to put the ending on something that God may be saying is the beginning. We struggle with conflict and tension and suffering and struggle in our lives. But what story does is it doesn't find all of the answers for it, but it helps us to find meaning around it. When we look at our stories, when we begin to write our stories, what we see is that the narrative in Scripture more closely connects to the narrative in our own lives. And the narrative in our own lives is one that has great meaning, one that has great significance, not only for what you are able to say and do, but in sharing that with somebody else, what you will find is that you have more in common in your story. You have more connection with other people when you share your story. And ultimately, you find that you have more connection to God, because what I believe happens when you begin to look at your story and think about your story and write your story is that you find that maybe God was there all along. Even in the moments maybe when you said, "Where is God? Why is God not here?" When we look back at our story, what we see is a God that is Emmanuel, a God that is with us. Not a God that is a problem solver, but a God that chooses to stay with us in the darkest moments of our lives, as well as a God that chooses to be in the most joyous moments of our lives. Your story matters. So last week, we invited you to come into a time where you begin to tell your story, write your story. You were handed a journal last week. We have more of those at the doors. We're going to have a time of journaling later. I encourage you in this series to take advantage of that. I am not asking you to write a novel. That notebook is no bigger than a passport, and you don't have to write more than 3 sentences to fill a page. But take it as a prompt. Take it as an opportunity to begin to think about your story. What I know about my own story, what I know about my parents' story and my grandparents' story is that I am so grateful when they write it down. My mom went through breast cancer 5 years ago, and I gave her a journal during that time, and I said, "Would you write in this every day? Because this is a part of your story, and I know that it is painful for you to write this down, but as your daughter, I'm going to need these words one day. And maybe your grandchildren might need these words one day." When I went through one of the most difficult moments in my life about 2 years ago, my dad handed me a journal that he had actually put on a typewriter, had printed up and made copies and bound, because during one of the most difficult times in his life that was similar to mine in age and in story, he wrote. And he didn't write his story frame by frame, chapter by chapter, but what he wrote about was how his story connected to the story of Scripture. And can I tell you, the words he put on that page made me get through that hard time. The stories that he told on those pages helped me to stay connected to God, to stay connected to my family, to stay connected, period. So your stories matter. Share them. Write them, because even if you don't think they matter, friends, they will matter to someone. And if you doubt me on that, I encourage you to go eat ice cream right after this service and go connect with a small group or a learning community or one of our many Sunday school classes and find a place to go and share your story. Because what I hope and pray and know will happen is that you will be encouraged, uplifted, held in a connection of community that is what God intended. Share your story. Okay, I'm going to get off of that. Share your story. Just do it. Share your story. All right, so today we're talking about what the punchline is in your story. Where do you see yourself in your story? You know, when I was little, I watched Wizard of Oz, and I've got to tell you, as a kid of Disney, there was a lot of really scary movies, Cruella de Vil, it's in her name, right? Cruel Devil. She was terrifying, right? But I don't think anything scared me more than the Wicked Witch of the West in Wizard of Oz. She was terrifying. The smoke that came around her whenever she came in the scene, the evil laugh that she had, that horrible green face and the witch's hat, it was all absolutely terrifying. So I learned at a young age, as you probably did as well as you read stories, is that many stories have a victor and a villain, and sometimes even a victim. A victor, a villain, and a victim. And our story in Scripture today also has all three of those. I want to read you a very familiar story this morning from Luke chapter 10. And I want to see if you can pick out the victor, the villain, and the victor, villain, and the victim. Yeah, those three. All right. Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 29. So here's the question, and here's the punchline that Jesus gives. So the question here is, by wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" So instead of Jesus pointing out to the crowd and being like, "That's your neighbor, that's your neighbor, that's your neighbor," Jesus instead tells this story. It says, Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him. When I come back, I will repay whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." So do you see the victor, the villain, and the victim here? The victor, of course, being the Good Samaritan, right? The hero of the story. The villain being the robbers, the ones who take an innocent man and beat him and leave him for dead. And of course, the victim being the man who fell into the hands of robbers. It seems like a pretty cut and dry story, right? 3 different people all fall into these 3 categories. But I wonder sometimes, what if the villain wasn't just the robbers? What if the villains were the people who passed by? I wonder sometimes if the Samaritan wasn't just the victor, but was also the victim. Because you see, being a Samaritan during that day was a label, and it wasn't a good one. We hear about a Samaritan woman later on, but it was a region in which people were seen as outcasts, as rejects, as those who were villains. And so what Jesus is saying in the story is the third person that walks by is a villain. Or maybe somebody that you see as a villain. And he is the one who helps the man. I wonder sometimes if the Samaritan is not just the victor, but he is also seen as a villain, but he is also very much a victim. A victim of labels, a victim of rejection, a victim of life circumstances that he probably didn't ask for or wish for. I wonder sometimes about the 2 people that crossed beforehand and the way in which they might be villainous. To stand by and to do nothing. Could you imagine seeing someone on the side of the road, beaten up and bruised and standing and doing nothing? Maybe not when I first think about it, but when I think about the way in which I go about my life with blinders on, that could be me. I could be the villain in this story. So where do you see yourself in the story? Are you the victim? Are you the person who maybe this last week or this last summer was going about your life and something happened that not only disrupted your life but shook your entire world? A day that was supposed to be like any other day, and all of a sudden you were on your hands and knees and you don't know which way is up? Are you somebody who maybe has blinders on? Who struggles to see people in need, even maybe when they're right in front of you, even when it is obvious, because you are busy, because you are distracted, because there are better things that you feel like you need to do? One of my favorite VeggieTales, I grew up watching VeggieTales, was this story of the Good Samaritan, and I loved this song that they sang. They sang this song that said, I'm busy, dreadfully busy, you have no idea what I have to do. And I find myself, if I am honest with you, I find myself singing that song during the week, totally forgetting that it was based on two people who didn't actually see what was important right in front of them. Are you the Samaritan? Are you someone who has had stereotypes put on you, labels stuck on you? Had moments in your life where you could either choose to hide, to be a victim, to struggle, but instead chose a different route, and by God's grace, have a story to tell because of it? Maybe you're the innkeeper. Have you ever thought about what a weird position it is to be in the innkeeper's position? This person who is a Samaritan, who you may not even want in your hotel, who you may not even want to give business to, comes in carrying a guy who is beaten and bruised on his back, and doesn't ask you, hey, is it okay if I leave him here? I'll come back and pay you the rest later. Is that okay? He just says, hey, I'll give you the rest later. If you'll take care of him, I'll be back. And the innkeeper is sort of put in this situation, right? Do I trust the Samaritan? Do I trust that he's going to come back? Do I help this person that I don't even know? Do I stay immobile in fear or confusion, or do I do something but not really knowing what the outcome is going to be or if it's going to benefit me? Where do you see yourself in the story? Oftentimes, the stories of Scripture are way more complex than we like to believe they are. Because there is not just a victor and a villain and a victim. We are all, and the people in Scripture are all those characters, those people at different points. We see that in the story of Job as he suffers and struggles. We want to be able to solve a problem and say, well, what did Job do wrong? He clearly must be a victim because all this bad stuff is happening to him, or at least at the very minimum, he is a victim, but he's certainly not a victor. And then we see Jesus healing a blind man in the Gospel of John. And before he heals the man, the disciples ask him, teacher, what did this man do? Was it his sins or was it his parents' sins that made him blind? We want to believe that our stories are wrapped around either the good things that we do or the bad things that we do or the things that just happen to us and how we choose to respond. And the reality is our stories are not singular. It is a mixture of all three. Sometimes we are the villain. Sometimes we are the victor. Sometimes we are which one did I say? Villain, victor. You got my point. All right, so there's a TED Talk called The Problem with a Single Story, and I want to read to you what this woman said, Chimamanda Adichie. We're going to pretend that that's the right way to say that. She says, the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. It is not that stereotypes are untrue, it is that they are incomplete. So when you write your own story, when you begin to think about your own story, if you are only putting yourself in one of those three categories, victor, villain, or victim, it's not that your story's untrue, it's just that it's incomplete. If you are always only the victor, you miss the capacity that God gives you for humility, and life only becomes about winning and losing and success and failure. If you are always the victim, you begin to be part of a downward spiral where you don't believe the best in yourself or the best in other people or the best in this world. And when you are the villain, the same just might be true. You begin to forget that God gave you a capacity for so much more. So this morning, instead of embracing a single story, I'm going to invite you to embrace a story that is so much more complex. One that calls you to see a fullness about your life, that the mistakes you make are important because they teach you something, and the things that you are proud of that you did well are important because they teach you something. The importance of telling our stories is that in telling our stories, in knowing our stories, we begin to know ourselves. We begin to know the depths of ourselves. And we begin to see a capacity for growth, a capacity to do more and to do better. What I love about The Wizard of Oz is that the Wicked Witch is a villain in one story, and she's a victim and a victor in the story of Wicked. What I love so much about the book and the Broadway musical called Wicked, which is considered the prequel to the story of The Wizard of Oz, is what you think you knew about this villain is not even half the story. It's not even a quarter of the story. And so then when I go back and watch The Wizard of Oz and I see that scary witch, all of a sudden I am not so scared of her. Maybe when you see more to your own story, maybe when you allow other people to see more to your story, we can begin to get out of the categories, get out of the boxes that we put ourselves in and put each other in, and see each other with the capacity that God has given us. So the question for us is this: in your complex story, when someone asks you, how did you get there? We often don't say, well, it's not that simple, right? It's often way more complex. There's often a lot more that we don't say because we're trying to stay in a category. So unfold, let it be complex, let it be full, take the blinders off, and let God show you wonder. Let God show you growth. Because the question for us is, what are you learning from this? From the mistakes, from the good things in your life, what are you learning? So we're going to go into a time of writing now. And if you didn't grab a journal, they are out the side doors. But I want to invite you to take that journal, and there's pens around you and pencils in the seats in front of you. If you'll take out that journal, and I'm going to put a prompt up here on the screen. And again, these are not big journals, and so you do not have to write a lot. But maybe use this as a prompt, as a way to get started. Here's the 2 questions I want you to answer. What are you most proud of in your life? When you think about the high moments, the good moments, the really important moments, what are you proud of? Not just what happened, but what makes you proud of that moment? And the second question is this: what is the most important mistakes you have made? Now, that's kind of a weird way to phrase that, but I think it's crucial. Important mistakes. That doesn't mean that they weren't mistakes, but what did you learn from them? What made them important? What opened your eyes to see something different in yourself, or capacity to learn or do something different? What are the most important mistakes you've made in your life? So when you put those 2 next to each other, what I hope that you will find is that in some of your story, you are going to be the victor. You're going to be the person that is the hero in your story, the person that is proud. And then in some of your story, you're going to feel like the victim. And in some of the story, you're going to even feel like the villain because we all have moments and make mistakes where that is part of our story. So as you see it unfold on the page, may God show you wonder, show you who God is, and maybe show you a little bit more about who you are. Give you a few minutes to write.